it's actually really complicated. No, it fucking isn't at all. Jake Shields needs to shut the fuck up. Peter Thiel runs society. Dan Bilzerian needs to be in prison, for the most part. And we live in paradise. Nick Fuentes is currently being attacked by a faction of the America First coalition. This faction primarily includes Dan Bilzerian, Jake Shields, Amy Dangerfield, Tucker Carlson, and others. What is going on is that they are trying to take Nick Fuentes' spot as the leader of the America First movement. If you don't know, the America First movement is basically the Israel-critical right-wing faction of America. This includes people like Tucker Carlson, Dan Bilzerian, JD Vance, Jake Shields, and of course Nick Fuentes. But the difference is that Nick Fuentes has been doing this for a decade. His show is literally called America First. He has talked about these issues longer than any of the main people in this space. He is the one who made it popular. He is the one who did the most to make it popular. So whether people want to admit it or not, Nick is the de facto leader of this movement. And recently there has been what looks like a coordinated attack on Nick Fuentes to overthrow him as the leader. I would say this first started when Nick Fuentes went on a vacation after a generational run. This run included interviews with people like Piers Morgan, Tucker Carlson, Bradley Martin, and others. He was getting more attention than ever, and then he went on vacation. During his vacation, CNN contacted these quote-unquote Groypers who went on to do an interview and represent Nick and his movement in a bad way. These people were immediately disavowed by Nick, to say the least, because they were idiots. They didn't look good, they were terrible for optics. Nick disavowed them immediately because they were not good for his movement, and I think that was intentional. That was the start of the attack on Nick. They were trying to portray Nick as the leader of some sloppy, unserious movement. They were trying to make his movement look bad and make him look like the leader of a chaotic group of people. Then after this, we got Tucker Carlson going on interviews saying Nick Fuentes is irrelevant. Tucker basically said he wishes I never interviewed him and that it was a waste of time. That Nick takes the conversation in a totally different direction, that he disagrees with a lot of what Nick says, and that Nick is basically a distraction from the real issue of Israel. Now, why would Tucker Carlson say this? Because Tucker Carlson is close with Peter Thiel and JD Vance. JD Vance is supposed to be the successor to Donald Trump. Trump basically started the modern America First movement through MAGA. Even though MAGA and America First are not exactly the same thing anymore, to say the least, at one point MAGA was America First, but now Trump has kind of lost his way. JD Vance is supposed to be the America First candidate in 2028. He is supposed to be the successor to MAGA, but Nick has been very critical of JD Vance. Why? Because we don't really know who this guy is. He's connected to Peter Thiel. He is, in my opinion, almost a Trojan horse for actual America First values. He is pro-Israel. He presents himself as this America First successor, but Nick has questioned whether JD Vance is actually America First at all. So when Tucker Carlson, who is close with Peter Thiel, and JD Vance starts attacking Nick, I mean, come on, it's pretty see-through. That attack is not random. It looks like it is coming from that faction, that Peter Thiel faction. Then after the Tucker Carlson attacks, we saw this America First event happen. This event was run by Amy Dangerfield and that side of the movement, Dan Bilzerian, Jake Shields. And they invited people who do not like Nick, people who are against Nick, people who do not actually represent America First, the base. This was not actually an America First event. It's more like a Trojan horse. They did not center Nick, and the event was an optical disaster. It made America First look unserious, it made it look liberal, it made the movement look like it can exist without Nick, which it cannot. But that's the whole point. They're trying to show that America First is, quote unquote, not just Nick. But the problem is, without Nick, this version of America First just simply doesn't exist. Nick popularized it. Nick took the hits for it. Nick was talking about these issues for a decade. These people only started talking about it once it became popular after October 7th. Now let's talk about Dan Bilzerian calling Nick a Fed, because this is really what the video is about. Dan says he started looking at Nick differently when he was debunking the Charlie Kirk conspiracy theories. He basically said he thought it was weird that Nick was not going along with the idea that Israel killed Charlie Kirk, but there's just no evidence that Israel did. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk, by the way, but what evidence is there that Charlie Kirk was assassinated by Israel? People say, well, he was critical of Israel behind the scenes. Okay, dude, seriously? Charlie Kirk was not some Israel-critical, America First figure. His criticism was not that Israel has interests separate from America. His criticism was not that politicians are serving Israeli interests over American interests. His criticism was basically that Israel was not properly convincing the American youth to support them through psyops. That is not the same thing. Charlie Kirk was not killed because he was anti-Israel. There is no evidence for that. He might have, in part, been killed because of his pro-Israel policies from a lunatic leftist, but not for being against Israel. He was actually killed because of what he represented. He was a symbol of white Christian nationalism, although he wasn't actually that. Charlie Kirk was writing letters to Benjamin Netanyahu on how to psyop people into supporting Israel. He was not anti-Israel behind the scenes. Anyway, Nick debunked this and said we cannot just lie for our agenda. The only thing we have is the truth. And somehow Dan Bilzerian saw that and said, that's really weird. Nick might just be a Fed. Okay, so if the truth makes you a Fed, what are we doing here? Nick was fighting for the truth. Dan got mad because Nick would not blindly support a theory with no evidence. That is not a contradiction. It is not a contradiction to believe Israel has influence in American politics and also believe they did not kill Charlie Kirk. Those are two separate claims. One claim can have evidence and the other can have no evidence. You can judge each claim separately. This is what these people do. They create false contradictions and say Nick is contradicting himself. They say, well, Nick believes Israel was involved in other things, so why does he not believe they killed Charlie Kirk? Because those are different, dumbass. Different claims require different evidence. That is not a contradiction. But Dan acts like because Nick does not support every single conspiracy, that means Nick is suspicious. That is just insane. That is not how truth works. That is not how evidence works. Then Dan also gets mad because Nick said to vote Democrat in the upcoming election. Not the presidential election, the midterms. And Dan says this is a contradiction because Nick says if the left gets full power, that will be terrible for us. Once again, both things can be true. Nick is not saying the Democrats are good. Nick is saying Republicans need to be punished when they betray their voters. If Democrats win the midterms, they do not get total power. They can slow down or shut down parts of the Trump administration, which in Nick's view, and everyone who's fighting for the truth's view, is not being America first. It also sends a message to the right wing that people want real America first policies. That is not the same thing as saying the Democrats should win the presidency in 2028. Those are two different scenarios. If Democrats get full power in 2028, yes, that would be terrible. But voting tactically in the midterms to send a message is not automatically a contradiction. Dan either does not understand this or he's pretending not to. So why is Dan Bilzerian doing this? That is the real question. Maybe it is loyalty to Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, their faction. Maybe it is about undercutting Nick's credibility. Maybe it is about replacing Nick as the leader of America first, so this faction can get the movement behind Vance in 28. Or maybe Dan is just really fucking stupid and does not understand what Nick is doing. Maybe he is just looking at the short term and not the long term. But either way, the result is the same. He is helping attack Nick and weaken Nick's position for that certain faction. After Dan Bilzerian attacked Nick, Nick responded. Nick said, Dan just wants to gossip all the time. Then Nick made a much more serious claim. Nick said that Dan invited him to his house, took his phones, brought him into another room and discussed how it would be possible to assassinate Israeli leaders. Now that is something only a Fed or an absolute idiot would allegedly say. I am not saying which one Dan is, but that is crazy, a crazy thing to allegedly bring up. And then Lucas Gage backed up Nick's claim. Lucas Gage said something similar happened to him, where he was invited to Dan Bilzerian's house. He said Dan asked how someone would be able to assassinate Ben Shapiro. I'm sorry, am I the only one who thinks this is insane? What are we doing here? Dan then denied these claims. Jake Shields came out and said he was actually at those meetings and that did not happen. But the only person who has shown anything resembling evidence is Nick. Nick posted screenshots with dates talking about the meeting and how weird it was. So this is not just he said, she said. Nick at least came with something supporting his version of the story. Now let's talk about the evidence people use to say Nick is a Fed. They bring up January 6th. They say there's a video of Nick outside the Capitol telling people to move closer. They act like this proves Nick was encouraging people to rush the Capitol. But there's no evidence Nick committed a crime. There's no evidence that the people Nick was speaking to then rushed the Capitol. And without that, there is no actual case. Nick was at a pro-America First event supporting the president when many believed the election was rigged, and it was rigged. That is not evidence he's a Fed. Then people bring up jokes, rumors, and old clips. They say, Nick this, Nick is that. But once again, where is the evidence? They bring up an old stream with a so-called Catboy. but that person is a straight man. He is married and later said there were no relations and that the stream was a joke. So we are using jokes as evidence now? Come on. There is no real evidence that Nick is a Fed. Meanwhile, Nick is the one who has shown evidence that Dan allegedly brought up federal sounding activity around him. So I'm sorry, who looks more suspicious here? The guy who got canceled at 18 for talking about this stuff before it was popular, or the guy who joined the movement after it became mainstream and then started calling the original guy a Fed? Here is what I think is happening. Nick is currently being targeted. This is an attack. There was the CNN interviews situation. There was Tucker Carlson distancing himself. There was the America First event that seemed designed to show the movement without Nick. There were media articles talking about the America First movement on New York Times without centering Nick, without having Nick. And now there are people like Dan Bilzerian and Jake Shields attacking Nick at the same time. I do not think this is a coincidence. This looks coordinated. Now, do I think Dan himself knows he is part of some operation? I don't think so. He's just an idiot. Maybe he does, though. Maybe he does not. Maybe he is just being used. Maybe he really thinks he is smarter than Nick. But I'm sorry, Dan. You really think you understand this movement better than Nick? Nick has been doing this for a decade. You got red-pilled yesterday. Nick's life was ruined over this movement. He was an 18-year-old kid getting canceled for asking questions about Israel before it was popular. A lot of these people only started speaking up once it became socially useful on the right. So give me a break with the Nick is a Fed nonsense. What has Dan actually done for this movement besides repeat Nick's talking points and then add crazy claims with no evidence? That is the problem. They repeat the truth Nick made popular and then add wild theories that make the movement look insane. And then when Nick refuses to support the wild theories, they call him a Fed. Also, Dan Bilzerian is crashing out over Nick telling people to vote Democrat. Tactically, while Dan himself is not exactly the most consistent right-wing figure, Dan was against certain U.S. actions in Venezuela and framed them as being for Israel. But where was the evidence? That action could easily be argued as America First, and it was America First because Venezuela is in America's sphere of influence under the Monroe Doctrine. Dan has also praised Muslim prayer and has taken positions that do not exactly sound like a hard right-wing America First worldview. He has also criticized the ICE situation where they killed two libtards who impeded law enforcement. He was against that. He does not get to crash out on Nick for tactical voting arguments when Dan himself is ideologically all over the place. The real issue is not that Israel controls literally everything. That is not the point. The issue is transnational loyalty, and Dan doesn't understand this. The issue is that people in American politics often seem more loyal to Israel than the United States. The issue is that Israel receives massive support from America, while many American politicians act like questioning that relationship is unacceptable. The issue is that lobbying, donor influence, and foreign loyalty distort American politics. That is the actual issue, not that Israel's behind every single bad thing that has ever happened, not that every assassination, every war, every problem, and every personal inconvenience is secretly Israel. That is not serious. And when people make those claims with no evidence, they hurt the movement. The reason the movement has grown since October 7th is because people are seeing the real truths that were ignored. But if you start adding fake claims on top of real ones, you destroy your own credibility. So to sum it up, I am pro-Nick in this situation. There is no real evidence that he is a Fed. There is no real evidence that Charlie Kirk was killed by Israel. There is no real evidence that Nick is betraying the movement by rejecting theories with no proof. What there is evidence of is that a newer faction is trying to push Nick out and take control of America First. Whether Dan Bilzerian, Jake Shields, Amy Dangerfield, or others realize it or not, that is what they are helping to do. They are trying to dethrone Nick as the leader of the America First right-wing coalition. They are trying to make America First exist without the guy who built it. And I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. Nick built this lane. Nick popularized this conversation. Nick took hits before it was popular. And now that there is momentum, everyone wants to take the wheel. Fuck you. But if the movement stops caring about the truth and starts caring only about narratives that are useful, then it becomes worthless, because the truth is the whole point. Once you lose that, you have nothing. That's basically it. That's the situation. Make sure to subscribe, like the video for more videos like this.